Can start.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our winter virtual speaker event. I'm Liz Niss, a longtime League member and currently president of the League of Women Voters Palo Alto. One of the key components of the League of Women Voters Palo Alto's mission is our commitment to diversity, equity, and inclusion, commonly referred to as DEI. We are an organization fully engaged in DEI in both principle and in practice. There shall be no barriers to full participation in the League on the basis of gender, ethnicity, race, and more. Diversity, equity, and inclusion are central to our organization's current and future success in engaging all individuals, communities, and policymakers in creating a more perfect democracy. We're fortunate today to have with us Lori Nishiura Mackenzie, the lead strategist for diversity, equity, and inclusion at the Stanford's Graduate School of Business and co-founder of the new Stanford VMware Women's Leadership Innovation Lab, offering her a unique view at the intersection of the two organizations. Under her leadership, the lab launched a corporate affiliates program in 2014 and is now the second largest affiliates program on the Stanford campus. In her work at Stanford in the Graduate School of Business, Lori is pioneering small wins to make the classroom experience more inclusive, to diversify our community, and to foster new research in the areas of leadership, inclusion, and diversity. Lori is a keynote speaker to a wide range of audiences and was featured as one of the BC's 100 Women 2017, and was interviewed for the award-winning documentary Bias, which premiered in 2018. She has an MBA from Wharton School of Business and a BA in economics from the University of California, Berkeley. Today, Lori will be speaking to us on the topic of the language of leadership for all. Language is a powerful tool. The word choices you make shape the culture in your organization. Sometimes we are too well thought out. In these instances, stereotypes about gender, ethnicity, and other characteristics may inadvertently influence the words we use in ways that can advantage some or disadvantage others on your teams. Lori will share her insights into how to learn the language of leadership so that you can be the best advocate for yourself, your peers, your teammates, and your organization. Before we begin, there are just a few things to note. This is a meeting format rather than a seminar, so you'll see that you will be gradually and generally muted, but that you can turn on your cameras on or off, use speaker view or gallery view. And at some point, we're going to allow your microphones to be unmuted, as Lori may want to have interaction with our guests. We will have a Q&A after the presentation, so please feel free to enter your questions and your comments in the chat. Myra Lessner, our Director of Events Committee, will do her best to get to all your questions. And now, with the greatest pleasure, please join me in welcoming Lori Nishiura Mackenzie. Welcome, Lori.
Thank you so much, Liz, and thank you, Myra, for having me come today. And to everyone who's attending, I'm really looking forward to this. And as I shared with the team, I'm open to any questions along the way, especially if you have questions. And maybe the easiest thing is to put them in chat, but if you have something you really want to hear, just unmute yourself or raise your electronic hand. So I'm going to start by sharing my screen. And I want to think about this title, the language of leadership. And I chose that word intentionally, not because I think leadership is a title or a place to be, but just we have these ideas about what leadership is, and those ideas shape so many of the ways we interact with one another, even in informal situations, whether we know it or not, and try to move us to the power of inclusive language. So why, I think you introduced really well, Liz, why language, but I just want to make this point. The most common way that we create and maintain a culture is through the use of language. I work with somebody at the business school who's a culture expert, and he says, if you want to know what the culture is, ask people, what does it take to get ahead here? And the words that come out of people's mouth are so important because it tells you what people truly believe is important in this culture. And so words, for example, if I say, this person is very successful because they have this degree, I've just told you what words are important to me. Or if I describe someone as uncertain, I've just told you what I don't like or what behaviors I don't. So words are really important. And as Myra said, many times they are shaped by unconscious stereotypes. So as an organization committed to having everyone contribute to our civil society, the words we use are really important because they will hopefully reflect our intentions and not stereotypes that come from historical ideas. So I want to go to some reflections on the kinds of words that are used, sometimes in politics, sometimes not. This, if you recall, this is not about politics per se, but about what we say. So in 2016, there was one woman candidate. And if you recall, this word was only used for one candidate, our woman candidate. And interestingly, some researchers did decibel ratings, and it was shown that Hillary Clinton was no louder or shrill than any other candidate. But interesting, that word is primarily only used for women candidates. If we go back to 1979, when Margaret Thatcher was, PM in the United Kingdom, she wasn't described as shrill, but perhaps this is the British way of saying shrill. Her voice was described as a cat sliding down a blackboard. Shrill. And so what did she do? She took voice lessons as premier to try to get your points across. She didn't work on her strategy per se. She worked on her voice lessons because there was something in what was accepted as leadership that had people not listen to her unless her voice was a certain pitch. So think about the words that are being used and whether they'd be used for everybody. If we fast forward to the most recent Tokyo Olympics, this is something else. These words were used to describe women participants on the board. If we increase the number of female board members, we have to make sure their speaking time is restricted somewhat. They have difficulty finishing, which is annoying. Again, thinking about language being influenced by stereotypes, and annoying, is that a word that we would use equally for everybody? And lastly, to a very recent 2021, November 2021 New York Times, we have Edith Cooper, who is a successful CEO on the boards of large companies like Amazon and PepsiCo. A colleague said to her, "There's no chance now for a board seat for the next 20 years, this colleague said. All they want are women. Edith, you must be in great demand as a Black woman," right? So his words are so strongly conveying his intentions. And what's really interesting, if you asked him, like, did you mean to say something very negative about Edith Cooper? He might say no. So sometimes we're not even aware, we likely all are, sometimes we're not even aware that these historical stereotypes have entered into our word choices. And we say things that we think are part of society, and then we realize, no, that's just part of the society that I've been schooled in and using the language of. So what we're going to do today for I'm going to end at least 20 minutes before the hour if I can, demystify the dynamics that create the uneven playing field and kind of present these different word choices and impacts, provide insights into how to thoughtfully and strategically use what I'll call the language of leadership so that you can engage in strategies to be more effective and inclusive in how you use your word choices. So about the playing field. Sometimes people say to me, well, the word choices pretty much negatively or positively impact everyone, but that's not necessarily so. I'm going to start by asking you to picture a genius, and I wonder if you'd be willing to put into chat the name of a genius who comes to mind. Anybody. And if chat's difficult for you, go ahead and come off mute and just shout out the name of a genius. Thank you. So I'm seeing, Megan, perhaps you said it best. I was going to say Einstein too, huh? So thinking about the way words evoke images. Interestingly, I didn't ask you all to name the same genius, but isn't it interesting the way our words evoke a very narrow band of ideas of who fits that? So as many of you said, Albert Einstein comes to mind for a great deal of people. In fact, when we ask small children to picture a scientist around the world, a great deal of them look like him. And the challenge is when we have these historical archetypes embedded in the words we use, it blinds us to seeing all of who we could see. So I noticed, Louise, you said Marie Curie, and Catherine, you said Stacey Abrams. And it's true, when we use words like genius, we don't realize that historical archetype tends to blind us from seeing people like Marie Curie, who's the first human being to ever win 2 Nobel Prizes, or Katherine Johnson, who is the mathematical genius who calculated NASA's way into space. So words have historical archetypes in them that prevent us from seeing broadly all of the people who could qualify for that title. For example, I want to show you a current day example of that. So 2 years ago, Forbes launched their very first most innovative leaders in America list. Very excited to launch a very exciting new area of consideration. And after they launched the list, they got in the middle of a Twitter storm. Like Cindy Gallup said, there were 99 men listed in this list and 1 woman. They missed seeing all of the kinds of innovation that there are. So for example, I think of Oprah Winfrey as one of the most innovative people in America. She's made us think about where we buy our products and from whom. She's made books popular again. People are reading, super innovative. And yet the way this archetype of innovation works, we, like genius, we didn't see everybody. Now, some people said, oh, well, they were focusing mostly on CEOs of large companies. Now, it's true. There are very few women CEOs, but there are, at the time, I believe 5, and only 1 of them made the list. So even saying there just aren't a lot of women that fit the criteria, even that can be suspect. So here's the thing we know. Words transmit what's important to us. They unconsciously have archetypes in them, and those archetypes, influenced by stereotypes, end up blinding us to seeing everybody who fits the words that we're using. So what happens is, like an optical illusion, stereotypes can influence your word choices. Like Forbes, they used words, didn't even realize those words were limiting them from seeing it. Or if I call somebody shrill, stereotypes have influenced the word choices I've made. Why is that? We are quick thinkers. We have slow thinking, but we like to use that quick thinking. And when we use the quick thinking, we need shortcuts. We need markers of how to categorize and quickly move on. Around people, those shortcuts are stereotypes. So if I think genius, I don't want to slowly think through all the kinds of people there are. My brain comes up with an archetype and I start to list people. In a similar way, when we say we want to hire, those archetypes can play in, the stereotypes can come into play and limit who we see as qualified for a job. So stereotypes do have a way of limiting our ability to see all of the talent that there is, all of the contributions people want to make unconsciously. Stereotypes are shared cultural beliefs. We don't develop the stereotypes, they're part of society and they're embedded in the structures of society. So even as what I hope I'm a well-intentioned person, stereotypes that I don't like still influence the way my brain works. So when someone makes a stereotypical word choice, sometimes they're not even conscious that it's happened. It could be this dynamic of the way our brains work. So I want us to think a little bit about language and performance by doing a little exercise. So there's a poll that I want us to take. You can either enter it in any browser you have. You can use your phone or anything. I can also put this into chat. So if you click on that link, it'll let you go to deciding if you were going to describe a top performer. It could be someone at the league who's just a top performer. It could be someone at your office. It could be someone in your family, in your neighborhood. Top performer. When I say that, do you think description A or description B works better to describe a top performer? So is anyone having problems using that link? You should be able to click on it from your chat. Or you can just type in mentee.com and the code 8287-9771. And let's see what words we use to describe top performers. And I see 8 of you have gotten on so far. Even if I show the results, you can keep entering them and they'll continue to reflect your comments. Great, yep, or you can enter them in the chat, that's fabulous. Let me show you what has showed up in the poll. Thank you, we have an A and a B in the chat competing. Here we go. So of the people who entered into chat, we have 11 who see top performers as team players and 6 as big thinkers. Does anyone want to share reflections on why you might see outcomes like this? Or questions about the exercise? Anybody?
I put it in the chat that it's because we're women. I think if you asked this of a bunch of men, you'd get B. You'd get the second choice.
Thank you.
You've got them labeled pink and blue. That's pretty obvious.
You know what's funny? It's the program. I didn't pick those colors.
Oh.
But I love where you all are going. Smart group here. Okay. So I will share my deck again. You've really tapped into some of the insights that, and I love what you said, Virginia, your best managers. It turns out that in many ways, our archetype of performance and leadership is gendered, where in general, the words in description A are more communal, the words of collaboration and relationship. It's not about I, they're about we. There's always somebody else involved in those words. And the first word is more I focused, like I'm influencing others, versus about the we, who's being influenced. It's about you being seen as a big thinker and risk. So it turns out the stereotype of leadership aligns with agency, which means independent action. The stereotype of men, as you've noted, is aligned with agency, and the stereotype of women is aligned with communal. And this has all sorts of consequences for how we name leadership, see leadership, and value the behaviors that we say. As many of you said, this isn't necessarily about men are or women are. Women and men leaders perform very similarly, but what we see in their performance is influenced by stereotypes about gender and leadership. Leadership really is about requiring both agency and collaboration, independent action and community work. And yet how we see and value and what words we use are often influenced by stereotypes. So if you read through job descriptions, for example, we'll see that we tend to remember to put in a lot of agentic words: must think, must risk, must drive. And then when I ask people, well, why didn't you put in much about collaboration or working together? They'll say, oh, we just assumed that. So there's this way in society where we tend to overvalue agency and undervalue collaboration. And in some ways, since we associate women with collaboration, even though it's equally valued in leadership, women tend to be undervalued or not seen, like the innovative leaders question, as qualifying, even though they are. This is from a study of Rate My Professor. This professor took millions of Rate My Professor ratings and looked at whether men or women were more likely to be described using these terms. And unfortunately, he didn't have race because the data he gathered didn't include it. And it turns out, if you look, there's not a lot of crossing over, not a lot of randomness. There tends to be not much overlap or crossover by how we see men and women using terms like brilliant or helpful. And it turns out brilliant is more linked to success as a professor than being helpful. Even though helpful is critical for their role, it's not valued in terms of promotion and tenure. So interestingly, that even though both are equally valued, some have more weight, men tend to be associated with the terms with more weight, which creates some perceptions of who's more qualified or less qualified for these leadership roles. At my lab, we looked through hundreds of performance reviews, and we found that managers writing about men and women also had these patterns. So describing women as appreciating how she helps run the organization with me, knows even her vision is she knows it because she knows where we've been. Versus the man was said, you know, he drives innovation, he makes things happen. And even when they say something negative, like being aggressive, it's positive with him. He's so aggressive in moving forward with the team. Now, here's the thing. This is a pattern we see. It does not mean it's bad that some men are driven and some women are collaborative. It's that we often use these terms without seeing all of who somebody is. Like when I say genius, and we don't necessarily think of Katherine Johnson. Or we see a man leader and forget to recognize the fact that it's good that he pauses and lets others speak first. That's not a sign of weakness. So we can use these terms in automatic ways to both see what we want, create the world, but also reflect it by not seeing all of what's there, by only seeing the stereotypical part of what we see. So we know from research that we tend to overvalue agency, even in positions like preschool teacher or teaching. We say that's very collaborative. We want somebody who works with the children, sees the children. And yet, when we think about evaluating them, we might say, well, they didn't bring new ideas to the classroom. They didn't draw, right? So even in positions where we want the person to be very communal, there's a way that those agentic terms get overvalued. And we even see this, most schools are 70% women and the principals tend to be 70% men. And communal language is most likely used to describe women, underrepresented minorities, people who are younger in orgs. So if we valued communal for everyone, why would we see these patterns of only using it for part of the population? In many ways, our language of leadership is what my colleague calls think leader, think male. That what we expect from leaders, not this group who talked about our managers though, but we think about leaders, we think about electing officials. Often we see this tendency to be more comfortable with a man leader. I think there's research Pew did, 95% of the people are comfortable with the idea of a woman president. And yet when they talk about the attributes of what they want, they don't align with how they see women candidates. So what does this all mean? That when we have narrow definitions of success, which are automatic, like I want a leader who's a driver, they don't really match who leaders are today. In fact, the word choices we make might be part of the problem that limit women's advancements and sense of belonging in organizations. Not being seen for all of who we are and what we contribute. And these have costs and burdens to people in our organizations. So words can really penalize behaviors to reinforce the status quo. And one of the terms that I'm really finding problematic is professionalism. People are told that they're not professional. And non-binary people, people of color, their unique attributes are called out as not professional, that word professional. And yet, who made up the rules of what professional is? So Sandra Garcia wrote an amazing piece in the New York Times about being told not to wear her hoop earrings to see clients because they weren't professional. She's a Latina. And yet white women who wear hoop earrings are often considered urban and hip. So again, how stereotypes of a word influence our word professionalism and allow us to penalize people who don't fit in. Lily Zhang is a Stanford alum. I worked with her as an undergrad, and she does a lot of work for non-binary people and shows that many of our word choices reinforce a binary and don't allow people with a range of expressions from being valued in organizations. Vera Bahirias was part of a really interesting launch called Med Bikini. My colleague at Stanford, Arja Mansalas, also was part of it, where women doctors were being advised not to post pictures of them in their bikinis, their swimsuits, in their personal Facebook feeds, because that would be considered not professional. Noting the men were not given the same advice about what kinds of pictures they were to post in their Facebook feeds. And lastly, Professor Tina Opai does a lot of work on Black women's hair. So Black women often spend a lot of money and time creating looks in their hair to conform to what traditionally white culture thinks is professional hair. And she shares a story where she's a professor, a colleague walked in and with wet dripping hair, a white woman colleague, and said, you know, you really should work on your hair. The look isn't very professional and it should affect your career prospects. And Tina had just spent 3 hours getting her hair done at a salon over the weekend. And this woman walks in with wet dripping hair to give her this advice. So we use words like professionalism. We think empirically, we think to provide insight in what it takes to get ahead without realizing that we also use it as a weapon to penalize people who basically aren't like the traditional status quo. These taxes can place financial and emotional burdens on folks who have to use their resources just to fit in. This was studied by Malaku, who looked at lawyers who were often, back to the study, and only, and the amount of cognitive, emotional, and financial payments they had to do just to fit in and just to enter the conversation and be considered competent. And it's the same for LGBTQ+ or TGNC folks. So TGNC, if you don't know, is transgender nonconforming folks. Pay this tax as well. So people questioning like, oh, if you wear that, does that really mean that you're a lesbian? Or why are you not wearing high heels to this client meeting when you know that we all try to dress up? So there are ways that we have these expectations that then place taxes on people. I think organizations like the ones we work at have an ability to try to be responsible for the impact and change the way we think about terms like professionalism. And then lastly, words can demand explanations that evoke emotional burdens. And I want to share a quote from a study that was done with students who worked in a student center. So this is a student who's trying to educate folks on things like what is TGNC and how does binary affect it. And she says, as an advocate, my job requires justifying the need for LGBT education, convincing them it's in their best interest to be educated about these issues so they share it with their departments. To be effective, I have to elicit empathy. Again, the expectation of professionalism and what conversations we have to break through it. She has to elicit empathy. So I share stories about students who struggle and what being marginalized feels like. I have to prove a certain level of trauma can and has happened before faculty and staff can see why having education about issues would help. I relive my trauma in those sessions, and even students do it to make the point. You have to be really explicit about the harm it does. So anything that tries to question our sense of professionalism or what we need to talk about in a classroom and organization causes a burden to those who are trying to push through the stereotypes that are reinforced in our culture with words like, well, we don't need to talk about that here. That's not an important topic here. Those words have very deep input for students like this who are trying to push through those barriers and create more inclusive spaces. So what are a few things that we can do? This is just a tip of the iceberg, and I'm hoping you'll even share some ideas that you have. One is to think carefully about definitions of success that you transmit through what you say is good or negative, especially around the language of success and moving beyond this binary sense of leadership, that you are either a driver or a collaborator, or that you must, I know you wouldn't say it, but I've worked in organizations where people in external relations were told they should wear high heels or change the way that they look to be more feminine or more masculine or professional. I often think of, remember the two columns, the collaborative and agentic words. Whenever I think about describing a person, even in an informal email connection, or when I'm talking about a candidate that I'm on an interview panel for, or when I'm told to introduce someone on stage, I always think carefully about using both agentic and communal language. I don't want to then inadvertently overvalue agency and ignore communal either. So how do you carefully think about using both? Yes, and I love yes, and. Drives and collaborates. So if I say, I want a candidate who drives incredible outcomes and collaborates with cross-functional team members so the entire organization rises, it's a very different person. Someone who's warm and ambitious, thoughtful and risk-taking. When I go back to the Forbes list, I wonder if they had used this idea, if they would have come up with different candidates. I want an innovative leader who sparks new ideas and implements them through bringing organizations and teams along on the journey. Might they have thought of someone else? Or what if they defined the context? I saw one of you wrote about the context. I want someone who innovates in technology, in business, in social impact, in voting rights. If I had created a list that made them think of all the contexts in which innovation happened, might they also have come up with a different list? Melinda Gates didn't show up, for example, and she's doing some pretty cool work. So when we think of moving beyond the binary, we're more likely to see more talent, but also welcome more people into what we're doing. I invite us to question the use of any terms like professional, executive presence are acceptable that might police folks. I worked with one board and they had women on this nonprofit board, but only one Black woman. And they said to me, well, she doesn't talk like we do. I mean, isn't there an acceptable professional way to communicate? And she's just not following it. And I worked really hard with them to unpack that. Who says what professionalism is? Who says that the way she's communicating, you want diversity and yet you don't want it to be different? So these terms, if you hear like, that's not professional, that's not what we know is acceptable, maybe question those before you start questioning whether someone has a contribution to make. My colleagues and I at the business school wrote this article on the cost of fitting in, and it links to a lot of articles like Med Bikini and the earrings that show the ways that people have documented and had the courage to speak up about the way they've been told they don't fit in, when in fact they're likely stereotypical and exclusionary things they're being told that they have or do. And lastly, make room for curiosity and growth. I didn't learn the word TG or the term TGNC till last year. And I learned that from a non-binary colleague at work. And they said to me, you've had the luxury of not learning this term. And as they've defined their experience, tried to find their community, they had to seek how to define that in the world, to find others. So I've tried my best since she said that to me, to be curious, to find out what are terms I don't know, and to try to include them in how I communicate as a signal that everyone belongs around me. It requires that we see that all of these skills are learnable. They're not inherent. Learning the language of leadership that's inclusive isn't something I was born with. I learned it through research and study and conversation. So most of this is learnable. And what it takes is curiosity and a mindset that you can, and that you will forgive the mistakes. It's our mistakes that let us know what there is to learn. They don't mean that we're not going to ever learn something. So I'm going to stop there. I said I would share for about, I have one more very fun mentee poll, which we can do now. So I will put this into chat as well. I just was curious about a reflection you have or an action you might take, just to share with us. We'll have a chance to do Q&A, but I thought it might be fun for us to, let's see if I can get my chat to show up. There it is. Just have everyone's voice recognized. Share a reflection or a new action. Any questions about this poll? Let's see, this one you can type in your answer. It's not a multiple choice. And then we'll go to Q&A. So queue up your questions if you've written, and I will, after a few people have entered, I'll show you, and I'll share this back out with you so you have some ideas. Yeah, teachers and students, we don't realize who we call a troublemaker and who's just a little ruly today, right? Yeah. Turns out we often tell young girls to think about others, and we often tell young boys, just try harder. And so we end up developing different skills. We use a lot more emotional language with girls than boys, and so maybe are more comfortable with different kinds of language. I will go ahead and share as you put on, and you can see if you're not done, just please go ahead and keep typing in. And otherwise, I just wanted to share what some people have as their reflections. And so the other word is agentic, but you don't need to remember. It's just individualistic traits or collective traits, I traits and we traits. I love this. Think differently about awardees. Often we have a lot of stereotypes in what we try to recognize. I'm dealing with that at my own workplace. So why don't I stop sharing? If you're still typing, I can possibly share this at the end, and let's go back to Myra to kick off the Q&A. Myra was having tech difficulties. Are you here?
I am here.
Okay.
Thank you. I am here. I'm looking in chat, and actually, oh, here comes a question. Most of it was the response to your last survey. Can you share more about language issues relating to race?
Absolutely. So in many ways, we'll use words that are based in maybe the language of leadership, but use them as a way to discriminate against people, and race is influencing those decisions. My colleague does research on some of the negative word choices used for people. Often you could call them microaggressions or aggressions. So they're called micro because they happen in these little moments. So there's two kinds of them. There's more than two kinds, but there's two kind of ways that her research looks at. One is, you can make a really negative racialized comment. So we might, for example, if I was talking to an African American, and unconsciously start to use words that reflect negative historical markers of being African American in society. I was watching a TV show, and the presenter was talking to a Black man, and she said, "Oh, you don't need to be a slave to fashion," right? And I never heard her use that word in the TV show. And again, we can unconsciously evoke stereotypes of historical markers about race that are only, just like shrill is primarily only used for women, these terms can be primarily only used for people of color in the United States. We can also say negative things about people in front of somebody of that race, like saying, "Gosh, crime is so bad around that part of the neighborhood. What's wrong with people from that part of the neighborhood?" And consciously meaning, or maybe not saying it, but meaning the Black people who live on that side of the neighborhood while your Black colleague is sitting there. Or someone could have been talking about the Kung flu or Asian, racism in front of me, or say, "Oh, you're such a ninja at that," with, or you look like a geisha today, when, I pretty much didn't know that I was going for that look, but there are ways that we use kind of historical race-based language. And the last one was the one with Edith Cooper, where we question competence and don't even think we're saying something negative. Like her competence as a board member was being questioned. You're so lucky as a Black woman, you must be getting people calling you off. That was pretty negative to say to her, but we use words that are actually discriminatory against people of color, especially around competence, without even questioning whether that was negative or not. So really great question. It's complex. One of my colleagues who studies power was saying we even do unconscious language around people who are different. So if we really like somebody, our whole body affirms, but then around maybe somebody of a different race, we might be saying we're happy to see them, but our whole body language might be very different around them. So it's both the verbal language of welcoming and appreciation we use, but also the verbal language, which across race might be very exclusionary.
Can you talk a little bit more about the body language piece? I think that's really interesting, and maybe there's some cues that you can share with us.
Yes, so really interesting. There's one of the most popular courses at the oversubscribed courses at the business school is called Acting with Power. And they look at a number of things, but the question started with, you can teach people about power, but how can you help people to use it responsibly? And we often think of power only as control, but power is also about connection. If we're going to do something as an organization, I might control you, but I need us to go move in one direction. So connection might be the underspoken about part of power. So our body language tends to be both, maybe you could think of as agentic and communal. We have body language that shows perhaps more control and authority. And if you look at actors playing, for example, a queen versus playing someone who's supposed to be a servant in those old dramas, the queen has a very still head. Eyes are looking where she wants them to look. She's not looking for approval. She completes every sentence, doesn't mind how much time she's taking, right? So our body language can show authority. It can also show warmth. So if I lean into you and I'm smiling, and as you're speaking, I'm nodding and I'm looking at supporting you, not showing my authority. Our body language conveys so much. Some great research at Haas in Berkeley that looks at the unconscious mismatch between our words and our bodies. And if we can try to think about that, one of my colleagues is working on a mantra. So if I am worried, like I'm going to say in front of Lori, I'm going to say ninja or geisha or something. And if I tell myself not to do it, I'll actually probably do it. But if instead I say, I'm here to see all of who you are. I'm here to make you feel welcome. Here just to appreciate you being here. If you prime yourself a little bit with a mantra like that, your body language is more likely to be aligned with your intention than to give out these cues that you don't really like me or your eyebrow goes up weirdly around me. So body language is fascinating. Acting with Power, great book. I'm in the middle of reading it from my colleague at Stanford, and body language is fascinating, often understood.
It is interesting, and even here we are all on Zoom, and just seeing from the shoulders or head up what kind of ways you can convey your authority, your warmth, your communal behavior. It's interesting to watch you, Lori, because you have such a great style. It seems very, obviously incredibly knowledgeable, incredibly engaging, without even being in a room with you. So it's fascinating to watch in that context. I don't see any more questions coming in, but a couple of things that were written about that I might just, unless you want to, Lori, there's a couple things like it's from Mary Alice. It's sad to see women leaders use male traits of leadership. Male privilege takes over leadership traits.
Well, what I might say that a little differently. I might say that as leaders, you want to have access to all of it, including sometimes what the role requires is you having more authoritative, still command, and at other times warmth, bringing people in. So all leaders, men and women, are more effective when we have access to this range. And yet we like and dislike that range, often based on race and gender. So for example, if a woman shows up as assertive, we often don't like it because we expect her to show up as collaborative, and we often penalize her. And it turns out a lot of women have a naturally assertive style. Some men who are too soft, we therefore penalize for being more collaborative, when actually we want them to be collaborative. We're just using these penalties. So I would say I would reframe that, Mary Alice, to say, we often penalize or recognize behaviors according to gender, and yet effective leaders often act very similarly. And to your point, I think the point you're trying to say is we try to conform women and men into a very narrow definition of success that's not effective. We tend to call that male. And when we do that, we're more likely to be sad that women are doing it than men. But quite frankly, it doesn't serve most of us to have to enact this very narrow definition of success. And in general, privilege does get more recognition in leadership. So we tend to then, in performance reviews, talk more about that stereotypically, and again, not to be binary, male associated kind of leadership, even though that's not what really serves us.
So here's another question from Ed. I'm probably not going to say the name. Shikata. Any suggestions for handling situations where others are not using supportive language? Maybe too much to get into at this point, so perhaps where to go for more tips. But I think you can probably comment on that. Any suggestions for handling situations where others are not using supportive language? Good question.
It's a great question, and it's a kind of a complex answer. So the first one is, how do you deal with things where you don't agree? So there's some degree of conversational competence that you and the other need to have to make these conversations go well. So for example, if we have an organization where we have a way that we bring up difficult things, that means there's already some conversational competence before we talk about race or gender or other kinds of unsupportive language. So one thing I think about is, how much conversational competence do I have? And there's some really interesting articles that look at, for example, if I affirm our values before I start talking about this, the other person's resistance may be lessened. It's work by Brian Lowry here at the business school. So if I'm going to bring up privilege and race and bias, his research shows if you have people first start talking about what's important to them and what they value, their denial effect or defensiveness is less likely to be activated. So that's kind of conversational intelligence. What gets people to be more or less resistant to something that's uncomfortable? The second one is, I always say, this is for someone who's not being spoken about, but if you're an ally too, I try to start with curiosity, because maybe that person doesn't realize what they did. So I'll say, I don't know if you know how we experienced that comment. And that allows them to say, oh, what comment? Like, what, can I share how I experienced that comment? And focusing on my experience versus that I know the intention of what that person said. Now, if it happened to you, it's very different than what I'm saying. If it happened to you, there's a lot of to make sure you're okay. And then if they're open to having the conversation, there's some conversational intelligence, you've allowed them to know that it didn't land and that they said, yes, I want to listen to how it landed with you. I found if I explain why the intention, which was the value, didn't hit the mark, and we try to talk through it, that tends to be one pathway. And there's a lot, I'd say, on conversation, like having difficult conversations. Kim Scott, who wrote Radical Candor, has some work on having these kinds of conversations. The yes and works really well. Yes, that wasn't intended. And what if there were unintended consequences? Not yes, like, you need to, right? Yes. And what if there were also unintended consequences? So it's hard. I'm not the best at it. I keep practicing. So I would say, don't give up.
It is an ongoing practice. I think it sounds like we all have work. We all have work to do. I think we have just time for one more question from Jeannie Lifcott. To what extent is racism based in power issues? So being racist is really about power?
That's such a great question. I would say all of it is. And how we maintain and exclude people from power. And so I was in an org and they're like, we want to do better. We want to do better. And they kept saying, but you're not right. And you don't do this right. And we don't like the way you do this. And you should be more like this person. And finally, it's like, I don't think you really want me. You're completely telling me everything I do doesn't work for you. So then why do you keep putting me through this? And they kept saying, no, we're just trying to give you advice. And I said, well, what are you learning? How has your leadership changed through this journey? And they kind of got mad at me that I was like questioning, like, what are you learning? How is your leadership changing? And that was the moment I really got it was about power. It wasn't about becoming more inclusive. It was about trying the exercises I was proposing until the power dynamic was about to shift. When I asked, well, how are you learning? How are you growing? How are you changing? They shut down and got angry with what I was saying. So power's really at the, I would say others have different points of view, at the core of it, and how these structures keep power in place. And if we remember that power is also about connection, I think that's the common ground to change those dynamics in a positive way.
Thank you so much, Lori. I think this has been just a fantastic learning for everyone on the meeting webinar today. Thank you again for taking time out of your incredibly busy schedule, especially this time of year. I want to thank our guests for attending and staying with us. I'm sure that there are those who wanted to come but weren't, that registered that weren't able to. Just want to share with everyone that this event has been recorded and it will be up on the League of Women Voters paloalto.org website. In case you'd like to review it again or share with others who you think might enjoy seeing it. We'll also have it posted in our upcoming communications. We have a section where the links are posted. Want to give a shout out to my committee. They're so fantastic to work with. Karen Kalinsky, Lisa Vogt-Levin, and of course our Zoom master here working behind the scenes, making sure everything goes well, is Luis Valentes. We will be sending a brief email to not just those who attended, but those who registered today, asking for your feedback. And we've decided not to do a Survey Monkey this time and give everybody a break. We've all had lots of surveys, I'm sure, over the course of the last year or two. And if you have comments, we're just going to leave it very open-ended. And so be on the lookout for that email. It'll come from League of Women Voters Palo Alto, and just asking you if you have any feedback to just reply to that message and let us know, and we'll get some info from you, what you liked, what you didn't like, what you'd like to see for future events, anything you'd like to comment on, we're happy to receive from you. Want to let you know that next up is an event on housing for all, another inclusive community-wide event, and that's coming up in January on the 26th in the evening from 7 to 8:30 p.m. So the registration link has already gone out. It was in the last voter. In case you still have that or want to get it from our website, you can do that and go ahead and register. There will be several more communications yet to come on that. So if you didn't register yet, no worries. You will receive more invitations in the month of January. Hope that I didn't forget anything. I want to just wish everyone a wonderful, happy, healthy, safe holiday season and new year. And we will see you back in January. Thanks, everybody. Bye.